housekeeping items is unclassified, and we are, of course, on an unclassified platform here in Teams. You probably just heard the message. We are recording the presentation, and we can make that available to you in the coming weeks. Please mute your audio, and please put your questions in the chat at any time. We have the NSRC's Head of Communications, Jen, here, and she will be monitoring the chat throughout Nic's presentation and relay those questions to him at the end. We will need to end right on the hour, but we're happy to continue to take questions and comments via email beyond that. Okay, with that, let's get started. So thank you again for joining us for today's talk at Odds with Oppenheimer. I'm Bri Steves, and I'm the director of LANL's National Security Research Center. We are the host of today's presentation, and we are also LANL's classified library. And we trace our lineage back to J. Robert Oppenheimer's technical library that he formed in 1943 as part of the Manhattan Project. Today, the NSRC is one of the largest technical libraries in the country, and our collections number in the tens of millions. We support a broad range of researchers within the LANL weapons program, as well as NNSA, other labs and sites, and our partners in the Department of Defense. Our staff of 60 includes librarians, archivists, digitizers, communications specialists, and historians, including today's speaker, Nic Lewis. The NSRC's mission is information. As part of our historical education outreach, we host presentations like this by Nic and our other staff. So a brief intro on Nic. He has a PhD in the history of science and technology from the University of Minnesota Twin.
You're muted, Bri. There you go.
Left off. So Nic came to Los Alamos in 2014 as a graduate intern with the High Performance Computing Division, where he wrote his dissertation on the development of Los Alamos supercomputing. He did a postdoc on the history of the lab's classified code cultures, and then lucky for us, he joined the NSRC in May of 2021. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Nic Lewis. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bri. Here, I'll share my screen here. Get these slides up there. And thank you all so much for coming today. It's a delight to give you this talk. It's a relatively new one, and I'm really happy with it. I think this is a fun talk to share with everyone. So I'm going to leap into this, and like Bryce said, if you have questions, please throw those into the chat, and we'll get to those at the end. All right, so I'm going to launch into this by giving a little preamble on where some of this controversy came from that I'm digging up again. So Norris Bradbury, who is the second director of Los Alamos, he's the one in the photo there who's not Oppenheimer. He once complained, kind of hilariously, that old H-bomb arguments never die. And he wrote this in 1961. And he was talking about the arguments around apportion credit for the Teller-Ulam concept between the two eponymous inventors. Well, he had no idea that debate would still be going on today. Well, the Christopher Nolan film, the Oppenheimer movie, has put another old H-bomb argument into the public spotlight. And that's the heavily contested decision of whether or not the US should build an H-bomb following the first Soviet atomic test. And the most intense debates around this issue went on for only a few months, really. And that was between late 49 and early 1950. But those debates were very politically charged, with several factions attempting to influence President Truman's official position on the H-bomb. So one faction was the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission. So the GAC was made up of scientists who would advise the AEC on nuclear matters. And the majority of the GAC's membership, with Oppenheimer as the chairman, argued that the US should not pursue thermonuclear weapons under any circumstances. So this ran the GAC afoul of some increasingly powerful politicians and high-level appointees and some military leaders who were really quickly embracing the H-bomb as the ultimate deterrent to Soviet expansion and their new atomic capabilities. So while the immediate contests were over once Truman made his public announcement related to the H-bomb in January of 1950, the arguments that had been made and who had made them and when became a political tool during the McCarthy-era witch hunts to discredit those who were painted as having been on the wrong side of the H-bomb issue, particularly Oppenheimer and his supporters. So Los Alamos was, and is often still, lumped into the category of having supported Oppenheimer's H-bomb views, either implicitly or explicitly. So this lumping together happened over time, and for a few reasons. And one of them was the lead up to creating a second weapons lab in the early 1950s, and the other was the larger effort to discredit Oppenheimer and strip him of his security clearance in 1954. So Los Alamos' leadership denied the claims that the lab had opposed or somehow slowed H-bomb development, but because most of the lab's side of the story was very classified, and because of certain figures who were in positions of power, who were deliberately spinning this narrative, there was little that anyone at Los Alamos could do against this tide of politically motivated criticism. So the sensationalized claims came to dominate the story around the H-bomb debates. So for this talk, I'm going to use lab archival and other unique primary source materials to demonstrate that Los Alamos' leadership and its staff not only tended to disagree with Oppenheimer's views on the H-bomb in late 1949, but lab policy had really gone in the opposite direction of the GAC, even before that position was known. And it continued to do that as the battles for influence went on in Washington. So this is not a post hoc throwing of Oppenheimer under the bus. It's meant to demonstrate that as much as Los Alamos staff respected Oppenheimer, and still do, the views of the two weren't always the same. In fact, Los Alamos and its former director had grown apart in some key areas of deterrence and international nuclear policy after World War II. The lab's new leadership had developed their own interpretation of the lab's responsibility to the nation during the early Cold War, and they firmly believed that developing an H-bomb, if that was at all technically possible, was one of those responsibilities. But politically motivated narratives between 1949 and the mid-50s deliberately obscured these important differences and their subtleties. And these narratives have tended to endure in the public mind, even after other falsehoods and shameful actions around these events have since been recognized and even corrected to an extent. And I'll talk about that at the very end. There we go. So in 1954, two journalists for Time Inc., the giant media conglomerate of the time, James Shepley and Clay Blair Jr., published what would become one of the more notorious accounts of the development of the H-bomb. So the book was called The Hydrogen Bomb, The Men, the Menace, the Mechanism. And it was part of a conspiracy led by the then AEC chairman, Louis Strauss, to discredit Oppenheimer publicly and to remove him from advisory positions in government. So the smear campaign and the behind-the-scenes maneuverings ultimately worked to strip Oppenheimer of his security clearance. And the H-bomb was an important point used against Oppenheimer in that effort. So Strauss, Kenneth Nichols, who was the general manager of the AEC, and others who were involved, they created a list of 24 security concerns against Oppenheimer to justify revoking his clearance just as it was coming due for renewal. But most of these concerns were connected with his past communist ties, which had been known since World War II. And And the AC had even reviewed them again in 1947 and had deemed them to be a non-issue. So there was a fear among this group that using these old charges against him in 1954 would make it pretty obvious that this was a political hit job. So Oppenheimer's controversial stance on the H-bomb in late 49 became one of the only fresh charges against him. And I'll talk about that stance in a little bit, but for the moment, it's enough to say that during the McCarthy era witch hunts, the past positions of scientists on the H-bomb issue would be weaponized, so to speak, against them. And that was why accounts like the Shepley and Blair book, and there were others, intentionally presented a very simplified and distorted version of the issues and of the many positions around the H-bomb. And those versions of the story did a lot to shape the enduring popular narrative that we still see today. So the Shepley and Blair book is today really best known and most criticized for Lewis Strauss having fed the information to the authors, both before and after the Oppenheimer clearance hearing, to discredit Oppenheimer. It also discredits post-war Los Alamos by repeating and building on claims that the lab's leadership and its staff were so enthralled of Oppenheimer that they intentionally slowed and even resisted the development of the H-bomb. They even accused the lab of having been infiltrated by communists. That's how far they went. So discrediting Los Alamos' handling of the H-bomb, it was very important for Shepley and Blair and for Strauss, because say if Oppenheimer's opposition to the H-bomb had only resulted in debate in Washington, then it would be difficult to argue that his advising on the issue had represented a threat to national security. But if the authors could claim that Oppenheimer had intentionally damaged a high-stakes defense project at what was then the only nuclear weapons lab in the US, then that made him a much greater threat. And it gave them a compelling point of attack against Oppenheimer as a government advisor. So this is why the book makes pretty much everyone at Los Alamos look either incompetent or even worse. Well, everyone, that is, except Edward Teller. So Teller was, in the Shepley and Blair account, a lone genius and a patriot who overcame suppression from Oppenheimer's cabal to create the H-bomb, apparently single-handedly, which is amazing. Did this to fight off the Soviet scourge. And this, again, was based on Strauss's input. And it even shocked Teller by how inflammatory the language was. Well, how did this story and the stories behind the story, how'd that get started? Well, it started in August 29th of 1949. I was on the steppes of modern-day Kazakhstan when Igor Kurchatov, who's nicknamed the Beard for this impressive shock of facial hair he'd grown during the program, he gave the order to set off the first Soviet atomic test. And the test went exactly as planned, which was fortunate for Kurchatov and his staff, because it meant they would not be executed as saboteurs. So good for them. So a few days later, on September 3rd, a U.S. reconnaissance plane detected elevated radioactivity over the Pacific, and subsequent flights found even higher counts. And this spurred full-scale investigations in the US and in the UK. So an expert panel of Oppenheimer, Vannevar Bush, and Robert Bacher, and Admiral Deke Parsons came together at the request of the Air Force to examine the evidence. And they came to one inescapable conclusion that the Soviet Union had the bomb and the US atomic monopoly was over. So on the morning of September 23rd, President Truman delivered the first public statement on the Soviet atomic test. And Washington officials were generally in agreement that the best option was to reassure the public that, to reassure them to prevent panic, or not to start a snowball of fear, as Air Force Secretary Stuart Symington had put it. Well, Truman agreed to this, and he attempted to stem the alarm through a very careful wording of his announcement. So he said, "Ever since atomic energy was first released by man, the eventual development of this new force by other nations was to be expected. This probability has always been taken into account by us." Despite the claims that the government wasn't surprised by the test, that wasn't really true. They were surprised. So the scientific consensus had been that it might take the Soviets about 5 years after Trinity to set off their first test. But most official government estimates were closer to the 7 to 8 year range. Some were really out there at 20 years, which was ridiculous. But no one expected only 4 years. And the reactions to this test were mixed in the defense and the atomic energy communities. So although Truman's request for public calm was pretty much successful, in parts of government, the snowball had already begun to roll. So to clarify, for the purpose of this talk, when I talk about the H-bomb, I'm referring to a megaton range or larger thermonuclear explosive, because that's what the main focus of the discussions were at the time. So at the point of Truman's statement, not many in Washington, much less the public, knew much about or even heard of the hydrogen bomb, sometimes just called the super. The terms will be used interchangeably. So this lack of knowledge makes a lot of sense because the topic was highly classified and there just wasn't a lot known in general about thermonuclear devices or their feasibility outside the Atomic Energy Commission by the late 1940s. So despite early enthusiasm and work on the idea at Los Alamos during World War II, the scientific and logistical challenges had proven to be a lot more significant than anticipated early on. And Los Alamos continued its H-bomb research after the war. It never stopped. But even determining the feasibility of just setting off a thermonuclear explosion on Earth was clearly going to take a lot more time and scientific advancement than had been expected when the project started. So much of the lab's H-bomb work after the war had been focused on performing the basic science and the theoretical studies that had to come before anyone could build an actual device. And the armed forces, for their part in this, they hadn't expressed much interest in the H-bomb at all through the late 40s. They were still wrestling with the challenges and the military value of fission weapons. So the military was not pressing to make the H-bomb a top priority at this point. So work on the H-bomb started with Edward Teller at Los Alamos during World War II, like I mentioned. And that was on a concept that would be refined and retroactively called the classical super. So Los Alamos continued working on the classical super after the war, after Teller left, and that was in 1949. And the only concept for a very high yield thermonuclear explosive that was then under development. So this concept is mostly what Teller and others were talking about when they were discussing the H-bomb or the super during this time period. So one of the biggest challenges with the classical super was that he was going to need a lot of tritium and probably a lot of tritium. Well, tritium is an isotope of hydrogen that's not found in nature. It had to be produced in nuclear reactors, but that came at tremendous cost, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Well, the more tritium that the classical super would need, the estimates just kept going up, the less feasible it became to produce one, assuming it could ever be made to work, which nobody knew if that was possible yet. So despite the challenges with the classical super concept, for some in the United States, the H-bomb appeared to offer a panacea for reasserting technical superiority over the Soviets. And this was attractive for a number of reasons. One was that the US, its military spending had dropped quite precipitously since the end of World War II. The Republicans had gained the congressional majority in 1948, and that brought tax cuts over the White House's objections. And this had thwarted Truman's proposal to regrow US conventional military strength in response to the Soviet blockade of Berlin, the degrading position of the Chinese nationalists against communist forces, and other events. And this meant that the fission weapons stockpile became an increasingly important means of offsetting the US's weakened conventional military position versus the Soviet Union. And Truman had already leveraged the US atomic monopoly against Stalin on a few occasions by this point. So with the US's atomic monopoly over, the H-bomb appeared to offer the US both a return to technical superiority and the ability to buy time to regrow conventional military forces. So it had this double value as a deterrent. So as a consequence, advocates of H-bomb development wanted to influence Truman's policy decisions. And some of the more extreme advocates, not all, wanted the president to favor a crash thermonuclear program, similar to the wartime Manhattan Project. So in early October, AEC Commissioner Lewis Strauss, that's clearly him on the left there, I saw him in a documentary, he took steps to suppress the possible opposition to an H-bomb crash program. So he'd heard early rumblings of the GAC's likely position on the H-bomb. And he urged his fellow commissioners to order the GAC to provide advice only on how best to proceed with its expedition and not make any comments on the H-bomb's desirability. So the other commissioners declined. They thought that was inappropriate. But Strauss then attempted to bypass the AEC's chain of command by writing directly to the president. The president, Truman, didn't respond, but he did form a special committee of the National Security Council, and that was to advise him on the nation's nuclear options. So despite Strauss's lack of immediate success, the crash program was about to receive a lot more attention. So only a few days after Strauss's first appeals for an all-out super effort, Ernest Lawrence and Luis Alvarez started circulating through offices in the Department of Defense, the AC, and in Congress, advocating a crash program for the H-bomb. And this came after the two had met with Teller at Los Alamos to talk about their strategy. So Teller had been advocating a crash program since the Soviet test was first announced. And he'd sent a series of messages to key figures in defense and in national politics. And one of the most important contacts that he had was Senator Brian McMahon. He was chairman of the very powerful Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, the GCAE. So even after, or even before RDS-1, the Soviet test, Teller had become such a frequent visitor of McMahon's that it started to interfere with his official work at Los Alamos while he was on official travel to Washington. And that was usually to consult for the GAC and for the AEC commissioners. John Manley, he's down there in the lower right, he served as both the executive secretary of the GAC and as Los Alamos' technical associate director. So he wore some pretty important hats. He remembered that he had to give Teller a little lecture on Emily Post, asking Teller that he live up to his official responsibilities on these trips before visiting others in Washington. That didn't sit well with Teller. So these communications in Washington that were outside official channels were sowing the seeds for a growing belief in some government circles that Los Alamos was in a terrible situation regarding its management and its operations, and they created an enormous sense of urgency after the Soviet test. So they also presented the H-bomb as the panacea for reasserting U.S. technical supremacy, but they often argued that Los Alamos was just not capable of making the H-bomb a reality. So Teller's renowned dynamism and his powers of persuasion were especially effective in shaping the opinions of those who had let's say, a less than robust understanding of the thermonuclear program and its many challenges. And I'll talk about that in just a second. So the idea for an H-bomb crash program found support in the GCAE, led by McMahon, and in some defense circles. But the desire for the super varied pretty considerably among individual members of the armed forces. So, long before Shepley and Blair's book, there were those who were already spreading the idea that in Washington, that Los Alamos was it was incompetently run, and that it was uninterested or even in opposition to thermonuclear development because it wasn't immediately launching into a crash program. Starting in late 1950, Teller and some others would build on these claims in their ultimately successful campaign to open a second weapons lab. And all of this gave Shepley and Blair fuel later on for lumping together Oppenheimer and Los Alamos. But these claims about Los Alamos weren't true. The lab and its leaders, which included Teller after he came back in 1947, they were strongly in favor of the H-bomb after the war. So starting in August 1945, while he was still acting director, Norris Bradbury, again on the left there, put together the lab's new operating philosophy that would guide the lab into the post-war era. So Bradbury argued that the lab's post-war responsibilities were threefold. So one was to continue the stockpiling of the wartime atomic weapons, to improve on those wartime designs, and three, to determine whether or not an H-bomb was actually feasible. This wasn't a given. If the H-bomb did prove to be scientifically impossible, then there's no need to worry about it. Win-win. But if it did prove to be feasible, Bradbury and his leadership argued that Los Alamos had a responsibility to national security to find out and to provide the ability to construct and test one if the president authorized it. So the H-bomb became this pillar of the post-war lab's mission even before the war was officially over. Well, after the war, about 2/3 of the lab's wartime staff departed, and that included Oppenheimer and Teller. And the theoretical division, which carried most of the early challenge of determining the super's feasibility, that shrank to only 8 full-time staff in 1946. Well, despite this, about half of T Division's staff time would still be dedicated to thermonuclear work, even in this shaky early post-war period. And this was done deliberately because of the importance ascribed to the H-bomb, and because interesting thermonuclear problems would help to attract new staff. This is important for multiple reasons. So by 1948, the lab had started to regrow after this post-war exodus, and the weapons programs, experimental and other facilities were really improving quickly at this point. And there was a lot of progress being made in areas that were crucial for both fission and thermonuclear work, including work towards understanding the fission process, making fission devices lighter and more compact, and proposing some new thermonuclear concepts. Well, because of these improved capabilities, a special superweapons policy group came together at the lab to focus on the challenges of the classical super and how best to direct the lab's energies to make progress on thermonuclear problems. So the policy group, which included Teller, helped to write the lab's 1949 lab program relating to the super. The lab had realized pretty early on that the calculations for the super were going to be very complicated, and that high-speed computing machines were going to be essential in this work. Teller had, in fact, at this meeting, concluded that the lab should wait for approximately 2 years before beginning large-scale investment on the super's development. This was in 1948. He was hoping that high-speed computers would become available by this 2-year window. The rest of the group didn't think that was ambitious enough. So the group reported that in view of this situation, the question arose as to what the laboratory might do while waiting for high-speed computers, keeping thermonuclear reactions continuously in mind until conclusive calculations were available. So the conclusion was that the only important long-range military objective for the lab was the development of thermonuclear weapons, and that the lab should reorient itself toward investigations that would increase knowledge of thermonuclear processes. So the report stated, "It is the opinion of the group that all arguments against the super based on questions of delivery and usefulness in warfare are irrelevant at this time, since the exact form which the weapon would take is by no means certain at this early date." So the group put forward a collection of theoretical studies of both fission and thermonuclear processes that the lab could undertake before large-scale computers were available. And it proposed 2 full-scale tests of thermonuclear principles. Keep these 2 tests in mind. So the group argued that the knowledge gained from these studies and these 2 tests would then be used for conducting a full-scale H-bomb test by 1951 or 1952. Keep a pin in the year 1952. So the lab's leadership built these recommendations into the 1949 lab program. And this was a full year before the Soviet test. Well, by the time the H-bomb debates had escalated in Washington in late 49, Los Alamos was already thoroughly committed to H-bomb development and its testing. So what Los Alamos did not support was a crash program on the H-bomb, because it likely would have been disastrous to U.S. fission weapon stockpiling and atomic superiority. Now I'll get to why that's the case in just a moment. Well, after the test, the Soviet test, there was hope at Los Alamos that the government would provide additional resources to make the lab's programmatic choices easier for the coming year, and that fortunately did happen. But Bradbury, on October 13th, he called a meeting called the lab's Technical Council. So this was made up of the lab's division and other upper-level leadership. And the point of the meeting was to discuss a directive on atomic weapons that President Truman had just issued. So you remember the special committee that Truman had convened with the National Security Council to advise him on nuclear matters. Well, that had reached a conclusion that an acceleration of the atomic energy program is necessary in the interests of national security. And Truman had just enacted that recommendation. So this resulted in additional funding and an AEC-wide mandate to expand its atomic stockpiling facilities. So the Los Alamos Tech Council got together to make sure that the lab's 1950 tech program supported the president's new directive. So Teller's job at the lab at this point was Assistant Director for Weapons Development. So he was in charge of proposing new ideas and experiments that would advance weapon design, and that included the H-bomb. So that's why he and John Manley, who was the Technical Associate Director, that's why they prepared memoranda ahead of time that they submitted to the Tech Council with their recommendations for the lab's program. So Teller's memo argued that the Soviet thermonuclear program was possibly, if not likely, in advance of that in the US. And he claimed, "If the Russians demonstrate a super before we possess one, our situation will be hopeless. In case of war, we can hardly survive, and it might even be possible that under such conditions, the Russians may force this country to surrender." So Manley even remembered in private conversations with Teller that he had said that unless we got really busy on a crash program, that he, Edward Teller, would be in a Russian concentration camp in the United States within 5 years. So this is where his sense of urgency was coming from. It was a very personal sense of fear. So based on these assumptions, Teller argued that the H-bomb should become the lab's #1 priority in an all-out super program. In Washington, he'd gone so far as to say that wartime Los Alamos staff should be forced to return for the crash project, and that Oppenheimer or Beta should be leading the program. So for the crash effort, Teller said that the other Los Alamos weapons development projects should continue only if they didn't interfere with the super. But the scale of the proposed crash program meant that few other programs could avoid interfering with the super in some important way. In fact, because of an ongoing tritium shortage, a super crash program almost definitely would have impacted the fission stockpiling effort. So Teller's classical super, which was the only large-scale concept then under consideration, was expected to require a lot of tritium. But US production rates were expected to be very small over the next several years. And there was a possibility of sequestering Hanford nuclear reactors to produce larger amounts of tritium for the super, but that would come at a very hefty price, and not just financially. So in the neutron economy of nuclear weapons production, for each kilogram of tritium produced in a reactor, about 80 kilograms of plutonium would have to be sacrificed. So that would definitely have impacted the size of the US stockpile of fission bombs. Because of that, in his circuits of Washington, Teller greatly underrepresented the super's projected tritium requirements. This was to avoid alarming potential supporters of the crash program. So Carson Mark, who was the head of Los Alamos' T division, he recalled, Edward promised people in Washington that the super project could get by with a certain amount of tritium. He had no particular basis for the amount that he mentioned, except that it didn't appall them. He chose an amount that had that property. It didn't necessarily have the property of starting up a super. Well, to his expert colleagues at Los Alamos, Teller only said that some recent developments and discussions have shown that the required amounts of tritium may become available in a relatively short amount of time. His colleagues weren't sure where he got this claim, and they were skeptical of it for a few reasons. And one was the worldwide shortage of raw uranium ore. So the EC needed uranium ore to produce, among other things, plutonium and tritium in its reactors. But most supplies of uranium ore in 1949 were sourced from only one place, the Shinkolobwe mine in what was then the Belgian Congo. So the few uranium-producing sites in the US and in Canada at that point were far less productive and a lot more expensive. So they were at about $20 a pound versus $3.40 a pound for Shinkolobwe material. So the plan to expand the US fission weapon production rate already put Shinkolobwe at risk of depletion within only a few years. And the EC was looking for new sources, but they weren't guaranteed to appear. So the EC was afraid that its already constrained uranium ore supply might slow to a trickle by 1952. In late 1949, it was safe to assume that large quantities of tritium were not going to be available in a relatively short amount of time. So without providing any other recommendations, solving the super's issues for Teller seemed to hinge on replicating the Manhattan Project. So John Manley, he did not dispute the possibility that the Soviets could have been ahead of the US in atomic or thermonuclear weapons development. In fact, he agreed that it would have been a mistake to underestimate Soviet technical developments. So he argued, it would be dangerous to assume that their progress is any less than ours. The Russian achievement should teach us at least one thing, that our state of ignorance of their efforts is so nearly complete that we should no longer assume any time scale for their developments, but rather choose our action so as to strengthen our position as rapidly as possible and maintain a rate of progress limited only by our resources for a relatively long period of time. So Manley argued that Los Alamos and the AEC needed to pursue a super bomb vigorously because its possession by one side would shift enormously the balance of power. So where Manley broke with Teller was over the crash program. So according to Manley, a crash program would disrupt the whole laboratory on its fission weapon work and just didn't seem to me to make any sense. So Manley recalled, you see, we didn't know how to do it, the super. No matter how many people would have been put on it, you might have made a little bit faster progress, but at the sacrifice of keeping things going on the fission business. So Manley formally concluded that we can neither jeopardize the future for short-range achievements nor such achievements at the cost of longer-term progress. And so he advocated an advancement of the then current program under development. And that meant improving both the fission and thermonuclear efforts as much as possible, but without sacrificing one for the other. So the Tech Council, agreed with Teller and Manley's concerns over the Soviet nuclear threat, but they sided with Manley's advocacy for an enhancement of the proposed 1950 program to avoid placing either major field of nuclear development at risk. So while a super crash program seemed potentially disastrous to the lab's fission programs, and by extension to national security, thermonuclear development still remained a high priority at Los Alamos. In fact, Hans Bethe and other visitors who came to the lab at this time said that there was a general excitement over H-bomb research that seemed to pervade Los Alamos. So on October 30th, 1949, this was 2 weeks after the Tech Council meeting at Los Alamos, the GAC issued its controversial report on the H-bomb. So the majority, championed by Oppenheimer, concluded that the US should pledge unqualified commitment not to develop a thermonuclear weapon. So they argued that this position would save resources for expanding the US fission stockpile, and it would put the US on higher moral ground internationally. Foregoing H-bomb development might also avoid a race with the Soviets to build their own. So the minority view, that was made up of Fermi and Robbie, they basically concurred, but on condition of the Soviet government's response. So this report provoked a strong reaction from those who were in favor of H-bomb development, including Los Alamos. So Bradbury found the GAC's reasoning to be specious, and he recalled, "I was far from agreeing with the GAC apparent philosophy. Don't do it because if we don't do it, nobody else will. I thought that was naive." Carson Mark later explained his thoughts on both the GAC's position and Teller's, and how he didn't agree with either. So I couldn't agree with Teller, nor the GAC. Working harder, yes. A crash program on the premise of an objective when we didn't really know what we were promising or talking about seemed offensive. But to say we wouldn't continue to inquire, which the GAC could have been read to be saying, that didn't seem right either. For all we knew, there might be a good H-bomb scheme, but we didn't know what it was. To promise Truman that we would deliver something was madness, and indeed, Edward felt fairly desperate the next year with the question, "How are you coming?" There really wasn't much to say. To have built up to a crash response specific to the Russians and make it a thing of national attention still doesn't seem to me to have been a well-chosen response. So the Tech Council's recommendations for expanding the fission and fusion efforts went into the new lab program, and that was submitted to the AC in December. In January 1950, the Joint Chiefs, who were initially hesitant towards the super, issued a critique of the GAC's moral opposition to the H-bomb. So they argued that while a crash program was not plausible, which was an agreement with Los Alamos, the feasibility of thermonuclear weapons needed to be determined urgently, and that planning for production and delivery of a weapon should begin. And this echoed the position at Los Alamos, and it ultimately swayed the president in support of the H-bomb. Despite the president's desire to keep the discussions about the H-bomb out of the public eye, leaks happened, and that brought the Washington debates about the super really vividly into the public spotlight. And this gave Truman a sense of urgency to bring the debates to a very swift end. So on the last day of January, he announced, "I have directed the Atomic Energy Commission to continue its work on all forms of atomic weapons, including the so-called hydrogen or superbomb." So Truman's January announcement settled the political debate over whether or not the US would pursue the H-bomb. But it wasn't a call for a crash program, which it's often described as having been. So Cold War scholars Ken Young and Warner Schilling have described it as only a minimal step toward thermonuclear capability. And Carson Mark likewise described it as a very mild statement and more of a qualitative encouragement than a directive, because it gave no explicit priority to the H-bomb. So it encouraged the continuation of Los Alamos' existing course of action, albeit with presidential approval to determine the feasibility of a thermonuclear weapon. This is approval that didn't exist before. In early February, Bradbury took several concrete steps in response to the president's encouragement. And the first was to place the lab on a 48-hour work week, Monday through Saturday. And he requested additional funding from Washington to support this commensurate 20% increase in pay. A lot of staff liked that part. Well, beyond expanding hours, he needed more staff. And he requested the funds to hire several hundred new staff members to enhance both fission and H-bomb programs. So now that more funding was opening up, Bradbury also requested that the AC produce increasingly large amounts of tritium between 1950 and 52 to support the thermonuclear testing that had been officially on the lab's books since 1948. So the amounts of tritium he requested were not likely to appear in short order, and he knew that. But the more tritium that facilities like Hanford and Oak Ridge could provide, the faster Los Alamos' H-bomb research and testing could proceed. So the crisis after the Soviet test had provided the political will in Washington and, even more important, the additional funding to expand lab staff and to improve tritium production during this continued uranium shortage. So Los Alamos, these were long desired changes, but the post-Soviet test crisis had at last opened up Washington coffers to make it happen. So in another step towards the H-bomb, Bradbury formed the Family Committee. So it was called that because it was meant to create a new family of weapons. It was made up mostly of division leaders in whatever staff they chose, and the committee coordinated the ongoing research on thermonuclear explosives. So Teller serves as chairman, and he reported to Darrell Froman, there on the left, who was the new technical associate director after Manley had stepped down. So the official first meeting took place on March 10th, but the unofficial first meeting had happened several weeks earlier, but that only lasted a few minutes. So Bradbury opened the unofficial first meeting, and he invited Teller to take the floor, and he asked him to outline some specific proposals that the lab could undertake in the thermonuclear program. Well, after his 6-month campaign for a crash effort, Teller had to admit in front of everyone that he had come to the meeting completely unprepared. He could only say that he was not yet ready with any proposals. So a number of audience members who remembered this meeting said that the room went completely silent, and they were waiting for an explosion of tempers. But it didn't happen. Instead, Bradbury paused and composed himself and said, "Edward, that has been obvious for some time." Teller can only shrug his shoulders and sit in silence. So Bradbury adjourned the meeting, and he said to meet again when there is something worth talking about. So Teller didn't mention this meeting in his memoirs or in any of his other writings, but his embarrassment must have made an impression, because when the family committee met again, this time for its official first meeting, he brought proposals for 2 thermonuclear experiments. And these were based on proposals that for the tests outlined in the 1948 TIC Council meeting. So they weren't entirely new, but Teller advocated ramping up these efforts to focus on defining specific experiments that would provide data that would contribute toward developing an H-bomb. So this was, coincidentally, the same day that Truman issued a second H-bomb related announcement. And this was at the request of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it still wasn't a call for Manhattan Project-style crash program. Instead, this was to remove all doubt that the president had given his approval to develop and test an H-bomb. Los Alamos was already working under that assumption. So after a lengthy discussion on March 10th, the family committee reached a consensus that both of Teller's proposed experiments would be extremely valuable, and they planned to conduct them as part of Operation Greenhouse, scheduled for the spring of 1951. So in just a few weeks, plans for these tests were already being drawn up and put into motion. So as we know, over the next 2 years, Los Alamos would build and test not just the Greenhouse series, but also the first full-scale thermonuclear explosive with the Ivy Mike test of 1952. Remember the Tech Council's 1948 goal of conducting a full-scale test by 1952. While preparations for Ivy Mike were underway, the often repeated allegations of Los Alamos being in a terrible situation and it, lacking interest in the H-bomb, that had taken hold in some important corners of Washington, and they were being used as partial justification for the formation of Livermore in 1952. And that was only months before the Ivy Mike test. So Oppenheimer famously supported the development of the telluride concept, which is tested in Ivy Mike. He called it technically sweet when he heard of its ingenuity in 1951, and he argued that it had to be pursued. So he recognized that if the US could come up with this idea, so could the Soviets. But the wheels were already in motion for those who wanted to remove Oppenheimer from government advising. And his past opposition to the H-bomb became one of the most important weapons in their arsenal, again, so to speak, for demonstrating that he posed a national security threat by reiterating and building on the false claims that Oppenheimer and Los Alamos were of one mind on the H-bomb issue. So once Los Alamos had a theoretically feasible H-bomb concept in hand, it took only 20 months to design and conduct the proof of concept test, and this was a massive and successful undertaking. But because the lab had not sacrificed fission development for a crash H-bomb program, this meant that the US had a large and sophisticated nuclear deterrent while the H-bomb went through its early testing and its refinement into a deliverable weapon. So as it happened, after Los Alamos had already invented and tested the H-bomb, some of the leading figures who had advocated a crash program, like the real Lewis Strauss up here, came into positions of power where they could reshape the H-bomb narrative for their political ends. So Strauss became the EC chairman, Kenneth Nichols became the EC general manager, both in 1953. And this is when the already harmful claims of conspiracy between Los Alamos and Oppenheimer were reaching fever pitch, and it became almost impossible for the accused to challenge successfully. So had it not been for these later political wranglings of the H-bomb debates, the fact that Oppenheimer and Los Alamos disagreed about the H-bomb in 1949 may not have been all that historically important, because Los Alamos and its leadership had already committed to a very different path than the GAC had recommended. As far as Los Alamos was concerned, the moral and the strategic concerns behind the H-bomb had already been settled years before, and the remaining challenges were technical and logistical in nature. And those were resolved with money, careful planning, and a lot of hard work, but not to the exclusion of the lab's other presidentially mandated responsibilities. So it was an odd collection of personal and political motivations during the early Cold War that made it possible and even desirable for some to lump Los Alamos and its former director together on the H-bomb issue. And just as some of these other acts of dishonesty from this era have recently been redressed, so I'm thinking of DOE Secretary Jennifer Granholm's vacating of the Oppenheimer clearance hearing, this related inaccuracy also needs to be challenged. Thank you very much. Alrighty. Thank you. Like we have a little bit of time.
Yeah, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. I thought I saw maybe someone put a hand up. There's a whole lot of people on this call, which is great. Hi, this is Jen, by the way. But yeah, if anybody has a question, please throw it in the chat, and I'll relay it to Nick.
Thank you. I also gave you a whole bunch to digest there, so maybe the questions will come later. All right. Thank you, Alan. Oh, thank you, Mr. Freeman. Okay, then. Well, thank you all for joining us. This has been fantastic. I really enjoyed being able to bring this to you.
Thank you.
You're all very welcome.
A really quiet crowd, Nic, but thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on and doing this talk. It was very popular. At the highest point, 145 participants. So thanks to everybody that shows up and listens to these very important history talks. But again, Nic, thank you. I really appreciate it.
So welcome.
I actually do have a quick question for you, Nic, from Sabrina Hampton, which is that, we know that spying is part of the reason that the Russians caught up. Would this urgency around the H-bomb have existed if the Russians weren't ahead?
Oh, the Russians were ahead?
If the Russians had not been ahead in the development. I see what you're saying, right. Okay.
Yeah, I don't believe that was ever the case. There were, of course, people like Teller believe they might be, but partly because of the surprise of them having set off an atomic bomb sooner than predicted. But I don't believe they were ever truly ahead. The perceptions that they were, though, that definitely drove people's decision making, including folks in Washington. So the urgency definitely was driven by a fear that maybe the Russians were. Or I should say the Soviets, not just the Russians.
And then I guess there, with the 2 minutes to go, or maybe in a minute, another question from Dan Lopez was about glaring inconsistencies from the Oppenheimer movie that you might care to, if that pincushion hasn't been stuck in full of pins already, if you have others to stick in there, in terms of this part of the story.
In terms of this part of the story, one big one that my colleague Alan Carr has pointed out, yes, it might be a whole lecture, it sets it up in some of the wartime scenes that everyone was opposed to Teller's interest in the H-bomb, including Oppenheimer. That wasn't the case. Oppenheimer was also very interested in the H-bomb being pursued and gave Teller a group in which to pursue that research. So that part was, particularly when it comes to the H-bomb, very inaccurate. But it's made for better drama, I guess.
There you go. Well, thank you, Nic, and thanks everyone. As Bri has said, her mic is decided to not cooperate. So I'm just going to say thanks to all as we're bumping up against the end of the hour. And as Megan also posted in the chat some links about some previous presentations, the YouTube link to one that we had called Nuclear Weapons in the Public Imagination earlier this year by John Else, and that's a great presentation. And then she's put a couple of other links also to Alan Carr's YouTube channel for high quality historical entertainment. That's great.
Check it out.
And know that this presentation has been recorded and will also be made available to everyone for later viewing once we run it through the usual channels. So many thanks, everyone, and thank you so much, Nic. That was great.
Thank you. All right. Well, have a great day, everybody.
Yes, we will adjourn. Thank you.
Thank you.